My name's Jared, and I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I'm a civil engineer and graduate of the University of Calgary. This is the long version of the video at over 35 minutes, so unless you're really interested, you'll probably want to see the short version. In 2012, my wife and I bought a home on a beautiful protected wetland in the community of Copperfield in Calgary. We and many of our neighbors paid premiums for the lots, and the wetland, which was designated an environmental reserve area, was treated as an amenity or feature. I have significant documentation to prove this. What you are seeing are photos of how the wetland was prior to a new residential development to the south and southwest of the wetland. These photos were taken between summer 2010 and fall 2015. My family and those of my neighbors who purchased homes on the wetland truly felt like we had purchased our dream homes. Whether it was lounging or playing in the yard, barbecuing, entertaining, or simply doing yard work, this wetland represented a beauty and tranquility that we took great enjoyment in. Waterfowl, muskrats, frogs, salamanders, etc. made the wetland home, and even great herons and pelicans visited from time to time. It was such a joy to have this piece of nature in our own backyard. And the key thing to remember as we continue in this, the AEP confirmed the wetland is protected, the city acknowledged their requirement to protect it, and documents in my possession show the city required review and approval in the form of a letter from the previous developer Hopewell regarding any changes to wetland water quantity or any other impact to the wetland. To this day, the City of Calgary treats all homes backing onto the wetland as having the influence of a canal or pond, which means that the city acknowledges that this wetland was to be a property value influencing feature. Looking at these photographs and how beautiful the wetland was, it's easy to see why the city, developers, home builders, realtors, etc. would all treat this wetland as a feature positively influencing property values. Here we see the end of our lovely wetland as it was. I find it somewhat ironic that the last photos my family and I have of a beautiful wetland, full of water and full of life, are of a magnificent sunset. In spring of 2016, grading construction for Vesta's new Copperstone residential development began. Signs of drying appeared that year, although local residents hoped that the drying would be temporary and would reverse after completion of construction. A large excavation appeared, and residents contacted Global News, who reported on the drying of the wetland in July of 2016. Vesta denied the existence of this excavation and claimed to Global News that there was only regular stripping and grading carried out. They said that their development would not make the wetland drier, and that the drying of the wetland was solely due to dry weather. Winter passed, and in spring of 2017, evidence of a drier wetland continued. Since grading and development construction is still not complete today in the fall of 2019, local residents and I hoped that this drier wetland would be temporary, and that Vesta and the City of Calgary were speaking the truth by saying the wetland would not be made drier by the development. What we could not have imagined at this time is that the project had not performed any calculations for wetland water quantity whatsoever. Here is the end of the 2017 photos, this photo being from October of 2017. And here we have photos from 2018 also showing a significantly drier wetland. Now here's 2019. I have many more photos of 2019 to share, but let's pause for a moment on this photo from October 7th, 2019. What you're about to see is a time-lapse of panorama photographs that I've taken between June 2018 and October 2019, and here they are. As you watch this time-lapse, I'll continue with the background history. Grading construction recommenced in 2017, and a new storm pond was excavated next to the wetland. I was immediately concerned because I wondered how a new pond would not steal surface runoff that previously drained to the wetland. How would the wetland not become drier, I wondered. I submitted preliminary calculations and a letter of concern, and the City of Calgary agreed to meet me. Alberta Environment and Parks confirmed that the City of Calgary had oversight to ensure requirements under the Alberta Water Act and AEP wetland policy documentation were met. On March 1st, 2018, I met with the city team, including water resources staff who oversaw permitting and approvals. I asked to see the wetland water quantity calculations that had been performed for the project, and I explained that my preliminary calculations showed the wetland would be made significantly drier by the project, since they built a new pond right next to the wetland that receives a significant portion of surface runoff water that used to feed the wetland. I was shocked when the city answered there were no calculations for wetland water. I then said the project had an obligation to perform wetland water quantity calculations, also known as water balance calculations, to protect the wetland from impact. This is the concept of no net loss and a requirement of the Alberta Water Act. The city staff then told me that it is not possible to perform water balance calculations, saying that groundwater analysis is too vague and elusive to be done with any value. I said that obviously those calculations can be performed, and essentially that's one of the key job descriptions of a hydrologist. Also note that groundwater calculations are typically performed by a hydrogeologist. Councillor Keating said that although I was saying the calculations can and must be done, that the city team was telling him otherwise. Who do I believe? He asked. I absurdly had to leave that meeting with the city with an action item for me being to prove that calculations can and should have been completed. After the meeting, I received numerous emails and phone calls from consultants saying things like, yes, of course we can do that. Just send us a request for proposal. I received other comments saying things like for me to just ask for the stormwater management plan, since they must have reviewed wetland water, or just ask for the wetland assessment and impact report, since they must have reviewed wetland water quantity and hydrology impact in there. I requested these documents, the geotechnical report, the land survey, and other project documents in spring of 2018, but the city did not respond to these requests. Therefore, I filed a Freedom of Information Privacy or FOIP request of the city and asked for every single email and document for this project in possession by the city. We're at the end of the time lapse of photographs here, and we're back on October 7th, 2019. From when I requested the project documents, skip 4 months to when, after several delays to promised delivery dates, I finally received the FOIP documents from the City of Calgary, containing over 2,000 pages. Remember how I mentioned the city said in the March 1st, 2018 meeting that wetland water balance calculations did not have to be performed and in fact are not possible to be performed? Well, the FOIP documents prove this was a false statement. City Parks' comments on the first version of the Stage Master Drainage Plan in the FOIP documents state very clearly, in quotes, please complete a water balance and hydro period assessment for each retained wetland to inform the wetland management plan that will ultimately be required for each retained wetland, end quote. So, the City of Calgary knew that they must ensure the Stage Master Drainage Plan contained wetland water balance calculations, but when I met with them and claimed the missing calculations was an unacceptable omission, they said that water balance calculations cannot be completed. Is there some way to see this as something other than a lie? Other than acting in bad faith? Other than gross negligence? In the same March 1st, 2018 meeting, the city team speculated to me that groundwater recharge may make up for a loss in surface runoff to the wetland. I told them that they cannot speculate that and that they require calculations. Again, the city team said that groundwater calculations are too difficult, elusive, and costly and would have no value or meaning, so cannot be done. Well now, the geotechnical report in the FOIP documents show borehole groundwater levels are significantly below the bottom of the wetland, which means groundwater will have negligible influence for wetland water, and water quantity will be driven by surface runoff. Even the Stage Master Drainage Plan for the project acknowledges these low groundwater levels. How is it that the City of Calgary, responsible to ensure permitting and approvals are consistent with the Water Act and Alberta Wetland Policy documentation that require review of wetland water quantity and reporting of impact to the AEP, just simply didn't look at the geotechnical report for the project? I truly doubt that they didn't look to this report, but whether the city knowingly made a false statement about groundwater, or whether they were negligent in not looking to the project geotechnical report or Stage Master Drainage Plan, this appears to demonstrate either negligence or gross negligence. Continuing the discussion of groundwater, after the March 1st meeting, instead of reaching out to the engineer that stamped the Stage Master Drainage Plan, the city instead engaged a consultant that was not involved in the drainage calculations for the project, asking them to provide some commentary to support the city's story. The city sent me these comments, and yet did not seem to acknowledge or understand what the comments meant, because they contradicted the city's speculation about groundwater. The consultant said, and I quote, "Groundwater usually contributes very little, if any, to the overall water volume in most Calgary wetlands," end quote. Further to this, let's ask ourselves, why would the city ask a consultant who was not involved, instead of asking the engineer that stamped the Stage Master Drainage Plan? It is my belief that the city did not ask the engineer involved because they felt that they would receive the truth, being that the wetland will be made drier. It is my belief that the city hoped that in time I would just go away and not reveal the truth. In the same March 1st, 2018 meeting, when one of the professionals on the city team said to me that it is not possible to perform wetland water quantity calculations as a part of engineering and design prior to construction, I said that of course it's possible, that this is one of the key principles of engineering, that calculations and analysis be done prior to construction. As we continue on this topic, I'm now intentionally showing you the city's own comments within the FOIP documents. I said that borehole groundwater readings should have been analyzed, and groundwater and water balance calculations should have been performed to ensure the wetland would not become drier prior to project approval and construction. This professional somewhat scoffed and said essentially, no, that can't be done. The only option is to construct the development without those calculations and monitor the wetland after the fact. This statement is absurd, mind-boggling to me. I drew the comparison of constructing a bridge without calculations and saying, I've designed enough bridges of about this span, so I don't need to do any calculations. It should require just about this size of concrete girders and about this much reinforcement. Let's just build it and monitor it after the fact and see how it performs. Let's pause for a moment on this last comment from the City of Calgary within the FOIP documents. It clearly shows that they knew these calculations had to be performed prior to project approval and construction. This appears to show that the city lied and that they acted in bad faith. The FOIP documents contain two revisions to the staged master drainage plan for the project. In the first stage master drainage plan, the wetland was planned to be a constructed wetland with a forebay, meaning it would receive stormwater from the development and essentially act as the stormwater pond. However, in the second version of the staged master drainage plan, the design added a new storm pond next to the wetland and diverted a huge portion of the designed surface runoff that was previously to drain to the wetland into the new separate storm pond. This includes a vast amount of surface runoff from the pre-development catchment area that fed the wetland. From my own calculations and report, based on pre-development and post-development land survey data, I'll show you the reduction in wetland catchment area caused by the development. Here is the pre-development wetland catchment area, and here is the post-development wetland catchment area. The difference is staggering. We'll come back to my calculations and report later. Now let's look back to the first and second versions of the staged master drainage plan for the project. I'm of the belief that one does not need to be an engineer to see this. Please see for yourself. Here is the catchment area feeding the wetland in the first revision of the staged master drainage plan. And here is the catchment area feeding the new storm pond beside the wetland in the second stage master drainage plan. Notice how the two catchment areas are very similar in scale? It clearly and obviously shows that the majority of surface runoff that was to feed the wetland in the first report is redirected to the new storm pond in the second report. In other words, the pre-development catchment area feeding the wetland has been drastically reduced, essentially to the footprint of the wetland and the backyards of houses that drain down to it. So, the project's own stage master drainage plans document a drastic wetland water quantity reduction, and yet the City of Calgary and the project still maintain the lie that the wetland was avoided and is not made drier by the development. The FOIP documents also prove that the engineering consultant who produced the two revisions of the staged master drainage plan knew that water quantity assessment for the wetland was a requirement. Section 4.2 of the staged master drainage plan is a hydrologic/hydraulic analysis of the southeast wetland, a different wetland beside the development. In this section, it states, only the runoff volumes to the southeast wetland was compared because the north wetland, our wetland, is now being used as a part of the overall stormwater management system for the Copperfield subdivision, end quote. In other words, because in the first report our wetland would essentially act as the storm pond, the consultant explains that they do not have to review runoff volumes to our wetland here. However, this also proves the consultant knows that if the wetland were not used for stormwater management, they would have to compare pre-development to post-development runoff volumes for our wetland. Well, guess what? In a letter to the city dated January 22, 2016, the consultant states to the city, this is an existing wetland and is not a part of the proposed development. Then on the cover to the second stage master drainage plan, the consultant states, due to the extensive comments in regards to the existing wetlands, the site has been redesigned as to not disturb them. It is thought that it is easier to review the project as new instead of a revision. Please note, however, that the comments previously given by City Water Resources have been incorporated into the report. The previous comments from City Parks Department referred to wetland disturbance and therefore no longer apply, end quote. Then, the second stage master drainage plan removes the section of hydrologic/hydraulic analysis for any wetlands from the report. Please think about what this means. This is a conscious acknowledgement by both the consultant and the City of Calgary to completely ignore these comments from City Parks. Read the comments. I believe this omission, this oversight, this error to be so glaring that one does not need to be an engineer to see it. Let's look at this last comment from City Parks that was ignored by the consultant when they prepared the second stage master drainage plan. A wetland management plan may also be required to ensure that the wetland maintains function, doesn't dry out, etc. during its use as a stormwater pond. Do you see the irony here? I am not naming the engineering consultant in this video because I feel they were unfairly kept in the dark by the City of Calgary while I waited for turnover of the FOIP documents. Also, I have reason to believe that they have been told by the City of Calgary to do nothing to rectify the omission and to say nothing. In the FOIP documents, the biophysical impact assessment for the wetland states no water will be discharged into WL04, which is our wetland. Details will be provided under separate cover in the stage master drainage plan. This has potential to diminish the amount of water that WL04 receives from adjacent lands and reverse the increased wetness observed in recent years." End quote. To reiterate this statement, it essentially says, we can expect the wetland to become drier. However, this biophysical impact assessment report goes on to state that this wetland was avoided, but that is a blatant contradiction. If the wetland is made drier, then it was not avoided, it is impacted. Also note that this biophysical impact assessment report states that the wetland is avoided without the required wetland water balance calculations that needed to be produced as input to the BIA, per City Parks' own comments. See them here again. Now let's look at annual precipitation. The city and Vesta Properties state that Vesta's development does not make the wetland drier, that they avoided the wetland, and they say that the drier conditions have been solely due to the dry weather over the years since their grading construction began. Well, let's look at the numbers, shall we? Also note that this is the City of Calgary's own data to avoid dispute of the source. Considering how wet 2019 has been, wetter than 2010, 2012, and 2015, and on track to be as wet or wetter than 2011 and 2014, let us now look at photos from those years. We'll start with spring pre-development photos. So here we're only looking at years that received less rainfall or close to the same amount of rainfall as 2019. And here is spring 2019. We received more rainfall and it is significantly drier. Now we'll look at pre-development photos from summer. So again, we're only looking at years that received significantly less rainfall or approximately the same amount of rainfall as 2019. And here's summer of 2019, completely dry. Here are pre-development photos from fall. And once again, we're only looking at years that received significantly less rainfall or approximately the equal amount of rainfall as 2019. And here's fall of 2019. It remained completely dry throughout. Although in both summer and fall we had days of significant rain, surface water never returned. After reviewing these photos in conjunction with rainfall data, is anyone going to attempt to argue that this wetland is not significantly drier after construction of Vesta's new storm pond? Where did the water go? Well, much of it ended up here. Note also that the bottom of the new storm pond is significantly lower in elevation than the bottom of the wetland. Now let's talk about calculations. In Alberta, and in the whole of Canada for that matter, construction and development projects require adequate engineering calculations to be performed as a part of the design process prior to construction. The response that we didn't do any calculations is just plain unacceptable. Let me list some facts. Fact: the City of Calgary knew wetland water balance calculations were a requirement, but didn't ensure they were carried out. Fact: the engineering consultant knew wetland water hydraulic/hydrologic calculations were a requirement, but didn't carry any out. Fact: the engineering consultant should have known that wetland water balance calculations were required for wetlands to remain from City Parks' comments on the first stage master drainage plan. However, they chose instead to make the invalid claim that City Parks comments no longer applied and that our wetland was not a part of the development, requiring the care and attention of ensuring wetland water quantity was not significantly reduced. Fact: the only calculations for wetland water quantity that exist are my own, and they show a drastic reduction in wetland water quantity caused by the development. I am confident that no other engineer, hydrologist, or hydrogeologist that attempts these calculations will come to any other conclusion than that this wetland is made significantly drier by the development. Fact: in Canada, stating that no calculations exist for a key aspect of a development or construction project is not a defense. It is the admission of an oversight or error. We'll return to my calculations near the end of this video. After I successfully disputed the City of Calgary's absurd claim that wetland water balance calculations cannot be performed and that groundwater analysis cannot be performed, and after clearly identifying that the missing calculations were an unacceptable omission by the project and city, I prepared a request for budgetary quotation from consultants for performing the missing calculations. This was an action item from the March 1st, 2018 meeting I had with the city. I received a detailed proposal from a consultant and submitted it to the city for review. The city replied to me in a letter dated June 27, 2018, about 11 months before I received the FOIP documents, with the following. The wetland was retained to protect ecological functions and biodiversity, not for stormwater management purposes. My response to this is, let's be clear, this is completely irrelevant. They had an obligation under the Water Act to make sure the wetland would not become drier and be impacted, and they failed to do that. Furthermore, they did not protect ecological functions and biodiversity, since the wetland is made drastically drier and biodiversity has been significantly impacted by that. Imagine how my family and neighbors felt when we saw this. This letter also says, based on our monitoring, the city is of the opinion that the wetland is functioning as intended according to all approvals. Firstly, the approvals didn't meet the Water Act and Alberta Wetland Policy documentation. Secondly, you are maintaining a lie to the AEP and public that the wetland is not made drier by the development when your own project documents show this is not true and that you should know better. Thirdly, is the public supposed to understand that your monitoring is reasonable, fair, and unbiased when they look at the photos and videos that I've presented? The letter also says, as previously discussed with you, the current regulatory requirements do not allow for stormwater to be used to supplement a wetland. The truth is, constructed wetlands with a proper forebay that act for stormwater management have always been and are still allowed to be constructed in municipalities in Alberta. There are many recent examples. Imagine how ironic is the following. The first stage master drainage plan shows significantly more water going into this wetland. The concern is brought up by City Parks and the AEP that wetland water quantity must be protected and that a deeper, wetter wetland would have impact on biodiversity. Some member of the project says, hey, if you don't want a wetter wetland, let's just build a new storm pond right next to the wetland, say the wetland is not part of the development, state that City Parks comments on the first stage master drainage plan don't apply, state that the wetland is undisturbed and avoided, and exclude any analysis or discussion of wetland water in the design. If this sounds like an unfortunate plan, well, this is exactly what happened, as is proven in the FOIP documents in my possession. Now let's look at how Alberta Environment and Parks, AEP, conducted themselves with respect to this project. In a letter from AEP to me dated November 8, 2017, the AEP says to me, if a proponent, landowner, municipality, developer were to directly impact the wetland or any water body within Alberta, an application for the impact would need to be submitted to Alberta Environment and Parks for review and authorization. Depending on the impact or impacts involved, wetland replacement may be required. They also say to me by email that, based on the fact that the development was subject to a land use decision, the local municipality has oversight in terms of ensuring that drainage is not negatively affected by the development. Post-development equals pre-development. Your question is best posed to the City of Calgary. The city should have received that information in conjunction with the development application. Skip forward to July of 2018 when I asked AEP for help, stating that I have demonstrated that the city made an error by not ensuring assessment of wetland water quantity, and I asked AEP to hold the city accountable, requesting the production of the missing wetland water balance calculations, the reporting of associated impact, and remedial action. Alberta Environment and Parks responds to me on July 9th, 2018 and says, any land disturbance that occurs outside of the wetland boundary would be deemed as not a direct impact to the wetland and not subject to regulatory processes under the Water Act through the avoidance part of the wetland policy. This is an absolutely false statement that contradicts the Water Act, Alberta Wetland Policy documentation, and the concept of avoidance. Imagine if the only requirement for avoidance of a wetland was to not have construction happening within the wetland boundary shown on this drawing. The Water Act and Alberta Wetland Policy documentation state clearly that impacts to the catchment area and overland water discharging to the wetland is absolutely considered an impact to the wetland. There is no way to interpret the documentation differently. Just look at a few examples straight out of the Alberta Wetland Policy documentation. Let's even think about this rationally. One doesn't need to be an engineer to see how absurd the contradiction from AEP was. Imagine the field day that some less scrupulous companies and contractors might have if they could essentially do whatever they wanted to outside of this boundary, as long as they avoid any construction inside the boundary. Keep in mind, in the case of this wetland, the wetland boundary is in close proximity to the pre-development high water level of the wetland. The AEP statement defies common sense, defies reason, and defies reality. Not only did Alberta Environment and Parks contradict the Water Act and Alberta Wetland Policy documentation when they made that statement, but they contradicted themselves. Look at the two statements side by side and read them again. The local municipality has oversight in terms of ensuring that drainage is not negatively affected by the development. Post-development equals pre-development. And then the next statement, any land disturbance that occurs outside of the wetland boundary would be deemed as not a direct impact to the wetland and not subject to regulatory processes under the Water Act through the avoidance part of the wetland policy. These two sentences state exactly the opposite. It is a pure and utter contradiction. In this same July 9th, 2018 email where AEP contradicted itself, the individual responding for AEP attaches a number of Google Earth images of the wetland and surrounding area from over the years and states his belief that drainage to the wetland is not negatively affected. He says, in taking all of the above into consideration, I am left with the opinion that the wetland in question is functioning ecologically equivalent than pre-disturbance conditions. Likewise, I also am of the opinion that from a drainage perspective, the quantity of water that the wetland is receiving is comparable to the pre-disturbance conditions. There's a number of very concerning and unacceptable aspects to this response. The first is that only 2 Google Earth images from July and August of 2017 were from after construction of the new storm pond next to the wetland. So the post-development images hardly constitute sufficient evidence to express a professional opinion. Also, review of aerial photos is considered preliminary review to understand conditions prior to proper engineering and design. Moreover, it was not the duty or role of the AEP representative that sent this email to carry out such review and provide a professional opinion. Only an engineer, hydrogeologist, or hydrologist licensed with a PEGA should be involved in water balance or hydrologic calculations for a development or construction project, so it was quite simply not this person's place, and they demonstrated a glaring and concerning bias. And finally, please think about this. AEP contradicts itself in this email by saying that as long as land disturbance and construction is outside of the wetland boundary, then there is no impact to the wetland and the wetland is considered avoided, which is absurd. And then goes on in the same email to provide a detailed explanation of why they believe drainage to the wetland was not negatively impacted and that the wetland is not drier. If it doesn't matter, why comment on it? All that Alberta Environment and Parks should have said is this. City of Calgary, I have an engineer telling me that your development makes the wetland significantly drier, and he tells me you've admitted you carried out no wetland water balance calculations. Carry out the calculations and prove him wrong, or if he is correct, report the impact to the AEP and the public. The bias AEP demonstrated in this email in putting the interests of the City of Calgary ahead of the interests of the public and the environment is concerning and even distressing to me. Let me talk a bit about my property value assessment. My 2019 City of Calgary property assessment was for $615,000. On June 3, 2019, I appeared in front of the Calgary Assessment Review Board to dispute this property assessment. I requested that my assessment be reduced to $534,500, which was the average of 2 independent appraisal reports that I had prepared for my home in late 2018. I explained to the board that all comparable properties the city used to assess my home were for houses backing onto stormwater ponds and having the canal or pond influence in property value. I presented pre-development and post-development photos for my wetland and showed how drastically my pond influence differed from comparable properties used. One home backing onto Copper Pond was assessed at $615,500, very close to my $615,000 assessment value. The wetland behind my home is in the upper photograph, and the pond behind the comparable home is in the lower photograph. Obviously, the difference is glaring. When I asked the assessor representing the city whether she thought that the home in the lower photograph was a reasonable comparable to my home shown in the upper photograph, she said to the board that yes, because my home is shown on maps to back onto a water body, she believes the canal pond influence to be properly applied to my home and that the comparable was fair. She noted that when assessing homes, they do not come out to look at the homes typically, and that basing the canal/pond influence on what's shown on a map is reasonable. In its decision dated July 15, 2019, the Calgary Assessment Review Board determined that the City of Calgary assessors' comparable properties were not reasonable, did not properly acknowledge the drying out of the wetland, and were improperly applying the canal/pond influence to my property. The board reduced my property assessment from $615,000 to $534,500. This was a small win for my family and local neighbors to see the independent and unbiased Calgary Assessment Review Board acknowledge this. But imagine, this is a reduction of $80,500. Please put yourself in the shoes of my neighbors and I. How would you feel if this was your home and property? Also, what does this whole ordeal say about how the City of Calgary conducts itself, looking at both oversight of this development and taxation? Let's now look in detail at my calculations. Using the FOIP documents obtained from the City of Calgary and topographical land surveys from pre- and post-development, I produced hydrologic calculations, prepared and signed and sealed a report focused on water quantity in this wetland. My findings are as follows. Because Vesta's development project includes installation of a new storm pond within the existing wetlands catchment or watershed area, the development significantly impacts wetland hydrology by diverting a drastic portion of the wetland's pre-development surface runoff to the new stormwater pond. The geotechnical report shows that groundwater will have negligible influence in recharging wetland water. Based upon surface runoff volume reduction alone, wetland water quantity has been reduced by about 62% by Vesta's development. In other words, the wetland will always have less than about 38% of the water quantity that it had pre-development. Water balance calculations, not included in my report, would take into account evaporation and evapotranspiration among other factors, and would most certainly show that the wetland is actually significantly drier than these percentages. Thinking about the findings of my report, let's look at this photograph of the wetland and new storm pond. Imagine you have a backyard where the ground slopes down all around to the center of the yard. You dig a very small pond near the center of the yard. Then you dig a second small pond near the center of the yard. You know that groundwater is low and cannot recharge the ponds. Do you expect that the two ponds will each receive the same amount of water as the one pond did? Of course not, and that is how simple it is to understand. We, the local residents in Copperfield, particularly with homes or apartments backing onto the wetland, have a difficult road ahead. Regardless of the proof to the contrary, much of it contained within the project's own documentation, the city and project continue to maintain a lie to the AEP and the public that this wetland was avoided and not made drier by the development. I am confident, as I've said, that any engineer, hydrologist, or hydrogeologist that attempts water quantity calculations will come to the same conclusion that I did. To this date, my calculations are the only ones that exist for wetland water quantity. That alone is inexcusable. You can also email us at copperfieldwetland@gmail.com. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video.